Now I'm going to introduce Stuart Lindsay. Stewart is a retired circuit court judge. He's spoken at a number of our rallies, and Stewart has been a very, very busy man, especially this last week, because he's trying to help, as we all are, and offer sound advice to people who are losing their jobs.
All right, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. It's, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, it's a privilege to be able to speak to you, and it's a privilege to see and address so many freedom-loving South Australians today. I know we're living in circumstances where many of you would be experiencing anguish and travail. I'm here to give you some encouragement. I'm here to give some practical advice, but I'm also here to give some warnings and about some dangers we're going to be encountering and some difficulties we're encountering. And I'm not here to make anything appear better than it is. It's not my job either, of course, to frighten you. That's the job of the media that are here today. And let me say they're doing a very good job of it. I bear in mind what Kathy says about... I bear in mind what Kathy says about... excuse me, more volume? Can we have more volume, please? No, that's maximum volume. I'm sorry. There we are. We'll just move a bit closer. All right. Excuse me a minute. Oh, they can't hear us at the back. You might have to move forward a bit. This is the sound system at its maximum. So if you're in the outer areas and you want to hear us, please come forward. Yes, aren't the media doing a wonderful job of frightening us? As I say, bear in mind what Kathy said about being respectful, and I say this with the greatest of respect, but to all those representatives of our degraded media and broadcasting system here today, I ask you, can't you find a more dignified way to make a living? You have disgraced the companies you work for. Those companies have disgraced the nation in which they make their money. It's about time you lifted your game, because you're taking us down with you. Now that might give you a taste of my idea of why I'm here. I'm here to tell you the truth. And I'm here to tell you the truth because everywhere we're hearing lies. Now, we all have our issues that irritate us the most, that distress us the most about this phony pandemic we've all been experiencing. Mine is masks. You all understand, of course, that last lockdown was all about the message being sent to Marshall when he met with his colleagues in Canberra that South Australia was behind the other states in the imposition of masks. We hadn't been conditioned enough. And that's what happened. It doesn't matter how long I live and how long this system of wearing masks endures, and please God it won't be much longer, I'll never get used to it. It sickens me. Every time I look out my window, every time I walk down the street and I see people forfeiting their freedom for nothing, for an imaginary, for a phantom virus. I like looking at the origin of words, and you may be aware of this, but that word mask comes from a Latin word masca, which means a spectre or a nightmare. Isn't that appropriate? And in fact, that Latin word goes back further to an old French word, mascara, which of course you would be familiar with. It means blackness and darkness. What an appropriate symbol for the age we are living in. Now, the reality is we are living in a state of emergency. Not the state of emergency confected in respect of this phony pandemic. We're living in an emergency in relation to our liberty. And it's been accelerating. Between last September and now, we might have thought it was accelerating, but my suggestion to you is that within the next 4 or 5 weeks, that same acceleration will happen again. So we better prepare for it. I'm sure your experience has been the same as mine. Occasionally we get these embers of hope and we think surely they're not going to persist in this madness, but they do. Don't kid yourself. It will only get better if we make it better. Now, there are 2 people in the crowd today, and I want to tell you a bit about their recent experiences in the hope of demonstrating what I've just been putting to you. The first one is a fellow called Andrew. Andrew's in his 30s. He teaches at a Christian school. Bear that in mind, a Christian school, when you hear what I'm about to tell you. He's a geography teacher. He had a very good relationship with his year 10 and 11 students, girls and boys. I know that because I've seen them interact with them. I know how much they love him. Now, we know how this mask mandate arose at schools. It's very instructive itself in relation to how this putsch has been carried out. When that last lockdown ended, the police commissioner was very careful to tell us all that he wasn't imposing a mask mandate. And then on the Monday morning, the first Monday morning following that, SA Health, that coven of tyrants, SA Health wrote a letter to every secondary school principal in the state and told them that masks were mandated. It was just a filthy lie. Masks had not been mandated. The only person in the state, in this irregular system we're living in, which is bad enough, is the police commissioner. He's the only one that's got the power to order any mandate in relation to masks. They put the word on him to do it. He resisted it. So they went ahead and imposed their so-called mandate in any event. So we're doubly tyrannised at the moment. There should never be a state of emergency. We all know that, and it's persisted now for about 20 months. But now, persons who don't even have the powers under the state of the emergency are purporting to impose the mandates. And what did we see happen? Nearly every school principal with whom I spoke imprecated not to impose the masks, imposed them. And this is what happened at Andrew's Christian school. Now, when it did, naturally enough, his students were inquisitive about that. They trust Andrew. And they asked him, is this the law? And he explained to them that it wasn't. He got a copy of the direction. He told them the truth about it. Now, it just so happened the principal of this school was walking past the classroom door when he was doing that, and he overheard this conversation with the students, and he metaphorically dragged Andrew out of the class. And there was a discussion at the door of the classroom. He didn't like the truth being told about the mask mandate he'd gone along with. And at that instant, within 2 minutes of Andrew being taken out of his classroom, he was stood down. Is that not astonishing? At a Christian school. He was stood down and he was told to come back in a couple of days for what we lawyers would call a show cause hearing. In other words, you tell me, Andrew, why I shouldn't sack you for telling the truth to his students. He was allowed to bring along a friend. He contacted Kathy's organisation. I was his friend. And I'm very pleased to be his friend. And I'll tell you something about that meeting in a minute, but let me tell you something just as ghastly that occurred before it. There was a Monday morning intervened before the meeting. There's usually a school chapel on a Monday morning, but this principal decided they wouldn't have chapel on that Monday morning. They'd go to their home groups, the students, with their teachers, all masked up. They'd go to the home group and they had to watch a video that this principal had made. And the video consisted of him interviewing persons in Sydney and persons in Indonesia explaining how bad the COVID pandemic was and how good the Pfizer jabs were. So if this isn't an emblem of our degeneration, what should have been a chapel service at a Christian school was a commercial pluck for the Pfizer organisation. Now listen, I'm not in the business of exaggerating things so that you get a false impression of what actually occurred. I'm telling you the truth. I'm giving you my commitment about this. There are enough lies being told. I'm telling you the truth. So anyway, the meeting. This is a chapel event that's taking place with everyone masked. And I thought to myself, what sort of fresh hell is this we're creating for our youth? So we went to the meeting. Andrew, to be frank, he had spoken firmly with the principal at the door of the classroom, and he spoke firmly again. He apologised if there was any impoliteness involved in what he'd said at the initial interaction, but he stood his ground, just like Martin Luther did all those centuries ago. Here I stand, I can do no other. And let me tell you, I was very proud of him at that meeting. I was honoured to be his friend at that meeting. Now the expectation was, and I can't speak on behalf of the school's legal representatives who were present, but very much my impression was we all knew that any sacking in these circumstances would be completely unconscionable, completely unjust, unfair and unconscionable. He sacked him. He sat there and read his prepared speech, this COVID fanatic, and he sacked Andrew instantly, a summary dismissal. Did I tell you Andrew has 4 children and that his wife is engaged full-time in looking after him, after them and him? He's had no other source of income. That made no difference to Andrew in how he conducted himself, either with his students or with that principal. There have already been proceedings instituted in the Fair Work jurisdiction. I'm confident he will prevail. But I want to tell you something about the sequel to that. Whilst I was present at the school, sitting in amongst all these masked individuals coming up to wish Andrew well, I saw that he had a lot of support, and that support appeared to continue after his sacking. Teachers were insistent that if he's gone, we're going. We'll be telling the principal that we won't be staying. Parents were saying, we will remove our students unless Andrew is... this is what we're going to do, Andrew. Just spare your applause for the moment until you hear the denouement of all of this. And both teachers and parents were insistent they were going to be writing to the school board. The school board, bear in mind, made up of long-standing pastors of Christian churches. They'd authorised and approved this. Well, this is one of the lessons I'm going to try and communicate to you today. Let me tell you that we're 3 or 4 weeks down the track from Andrew's sacking, and none of that has happened. No teacher resigned. No parents took their children out of the school. The board didn't receive any kind of communications from the school community.
Don't move. Sorry.
So there's the lesson. You're on your own in this. I don't know whether any of you watched the old Western High Noon. Well, if you haven't watched it, you should find a copy of it and watch it now. We should be going back to a lot of our things in our cultural memory. They teach us lessons. They come from our Christian foundations. Andrew was like Gary Cooper, going out in the street to face the evil that had just come off the noon train, that we're going to take the people back into lawlessness. 4 against 1. And all the townspeople from whom he'd sought help were cowering in their homes. That was Andrew's experience. How in hell's name do you think we're going to make a difference in this tyranny unless we're prepared to make the sort of sacrifices that Andrew made. Now let me tell you, he has made a difference. He has made a difference. He's made a difference to those students who saw what he did. Don't forget that. These 13, 14 and 15-year-olds who love the man anyway, they know what he's done. They will be able to contrast his example of manliness to what they see going on in the world around them. The same that your children see every day, with men and women compliant with these ridiculous masks that have absolutely no scientific foundation. He's a hero, in my view. And I remember giving a speech at Victoria Square, I think it was in December of last year, and I remember talking about the 3 weeks to flatten the curve, if you remember that, and schools being plastered with signs and paintings that the students had been ordered to make about the medical heroes that we're dealing with this pandemic. The medical heroes, overpaid doctors and overpaid nurses fighting a pandemic that didn't even exist. But Andrew's a real hero, and if he's here today, and I think he is, I'm just going to ask him, if I may, to come forward, and I'd ask you to all express your appreciation of the example he's given us all. Are you here, Andrew?
You know, what I've learned from this really is that if we speak and if we walk in truth, then this all stops when we say no. I want to thank Stewart for his support in me, but not only myself, but others who have experienced job losses or who have experienced also persecution in their workplaces, in their families, in their communities. This is what we're all seeing, a huge division which ought not to occur. But when we know when something is right, then we have a conscience which doesn't condemn us. And I've thought about that many times. Should I have spoken up and stood up for what I knew what was right? And I know that if I'd done the wrong thing, there would be something inside me just grating, which would be making me feel uncomfortable, like I'd had an argument with my wife and it was time to apologise. But I haven't felt that at all. And I know that when we do what is right, we have that peace inside us, and we all need to do what's right, and we all need to say no. Thank you guys for coming out.
Look, I've got to move along because there are other people who've got a lot of very, very good things to say to us all today. But just before we leave the topic of the school, this is a Christian school, of course, that follows a man that said, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And then they sacked their teacher for telling the truth. Christians, and I know there are many Christians here today, you have to reclaim your church from the servants of a corrupt and authoritarian state who currently occupy it. They are their servants. When they were told to close their church last year, they closed it. When they were told to stop giving communion, they stopped giving communion. When they were told you can't sing, they stopped singing. When they were told you had to sing with masks on your face, they put masks on the congregation's face. If they were told they had to pray standing on one leg, they'd do it. We won't rescue Christian civilization until the church itself is rescued. The second person I want to tell you about, I'm going to call her Natasha. That's not her real name. She's an aged care worker. She had the flu jab in June. You remember that? It was aged care workers they picked on in relation to that. And of course that moved forward to the COVID jab in September. Do you see how these bureaucrats plot and plan everything insidiously? They've got the time and our money to do it all of course. Someone told me a long time ago, there's Malcolm Muggeridge, I think it was, the big difference between people is between those who see life as a process and those who see life as a drama. And I like to think Christian people, I like to think all of us here today are the drama kind of people. If you see life as a drama, you see yourself as playing a part. You see yourself as making a difference. And you hope that the part you play and the difference you make means that the story, the drama, will have a happy ending. As distinct from process people. I don't think I need to describe who they are. We're just surrounded by them every day and every night. Why do they pick up on, why do you think they picked up on the old care workers? Would it be because they're in the lower paid of the community? The more vulnerable in the community? Lots of people who don't speak English as a first language? That's why they did it. Where were their unions? Isn't this the group of people that unions are there to protect? Are there any members of any trade union officials with us today? No, I didn't think so. Any members of the Labor Party here today? No, I didn't think so either. Those union officials are determined to get their backsides on superannuation boards or in Parliament. They don't care about persons like Natasha that I'm about to describe. Now, the direction that was brought out on the 20th of August that related to old age care workers was one that gave two possibilities for exemption. The first was in a medical exemption. And the medical exemption is just what it sounds like. It was a medical exemption given by a qualified legal practitioner. It was his or her decision as to whether that person was medically exempt. Now, sometimes the doctors didn't quite word it correctly and we changed the wording of it and they were resubmitted. As for this fellow Wade that Kathy told you about, this Stephen Wade, who says there are only a handful of exemptions, what he didn't tell you, of course, is there would have been hundreds that they rejected. They weren't entitled to reject them. The nursing homes were instructed to reject them and told it wasn't an adequate medical exemption. They had no authority to do that. The police commissioner hadn't written anything into the direction saying, oh, it's up to the nursing home to adjudicate as to whether it's adequate or not. It was the medical practitioner's adjudication that mattered. Yet another example of SA Health conducting themselves completely unlawfully. This is the kind of situation we're living in. The other exemption was one where you could get a temporary exemption if to ensure the maintenance of quality of care of the residents. And a temporary exemption might have been enough. Morrison might have read the Bible at one of his Christian churches and realised the terrible things he was doing to the nation that he leads. Just think what could have been done with that if the nursing home workers had been well organised. If the unions had done the work that they should have been doing, it could have been a situation of one of us goes, all of us goes. Isn't that what unionisms are meant to be about? Isn't that what solidarity is meant to be about? There was none of it. But let that be a warning to other professions. I'm sure there are nurses here today. There are waiters and waitresses from hospitality. There are there are policemen. You could be next. Teachers. You've got to organise. Your unions aren't going to do it for you. Let me give the burial rights for trade unions today. They've gone. They've ceased to do their job long ago. They have no reason to exist. But the corollary of that is you've got to organise yourselves. Don't sit back and think it's going to happen. It's not going to happen unless you organise. Get your workmates together. Say, are we in this together? And if you are in it together, you look after each other. But you've got to do it. Don't wait for them to come for you. Don't wait to see if this pandemic if this tyranny is going to disappear. It's not. It's ramping up. And it's ramping up very quickly. Maritime industry workers, they're the latest. You may not be aware of this. 27th of September, maritime workers, people who work at all of the ports, when ships come in, they go and they service them, they service the engine, they service the crew. They won't get on board unless they're jabbed. Were you aware of that? Maritime Union, not interested. The people I've spoken to who've said, I went to the union, and they said, well, why don't you just get the jab? What I'm trying to communicate to you all, if you're in a service industry, if you're in an industry that's about to be the next along the slaughterhouse line, organise yourselves and do it quickly. Australia's been through this before. Australia in the 1950s tangled with communism in the unions. It was rampant. There was a party called the DLP formed. They formed their own industrial association. So we've been through this before. It's not new. What might be new is that we don't have the character of our forebears in the 1950s. Well, you better hurry up and find it, or we'll be finished. Now, Natasha had a perfectly lawful exemption. She was sacked. And she'll be off to the Fair Work Commission as well. Let me just say a quick word. I know there are other speakers. Let me tell you a quick word. It may be useful about the Fair Work Act. You know that Morrison's strategy has been to delegate all the dirty work for this phony pandemic to the states. And he's done that because by doing that he avoids complications that might arise from a certain document called the Commonwealth Constitution. He's essentially kicked it into touch by gathering all these creepy premiers. He gets the spinster premiers from Queensland and New South Wales, fresh from passing their abortion to birth laws, before they start to take the lives of children with their compulsory vaccines. He gets them, he gets Marshall, he gets all the health officers together, he throws money at them and he says, you go and do that work because then we won't be vulnerable to constitutional challenges. And he's trying to do the same, offload it to corporations in respect of employees. You see, he's doing that. But his problem is, the problem for this man is that there's something called the Fair Work Act and it's got teeth. And they might try and persuade you that the unfair dismissal provisions and the unlawful termination provisions aren't relevant in this situation. That's a total lie. If you have a medical exemption, the provisions in relation to medical exemptions with the aged care workers will be very similar in the next series of directions. And so you've got to try and take use of them if you can. You've got to play them for all they're worth. If it so happens that you're unsuccessful, because they've changed the regulations in the meantime, well, that will only radicalise more of your workmates. Either way, there's no downside to being as strong as possible in exerting your rights in the Fair Work Commission. I should say a word about other strategies, and I'm nearing the end now. Look, just before I leave the Commonwealth, and this is said with due respect to all of the people that are trying to do their bit in resisting this tyranny, but you might hear from time to time advice about why not utilise the Biosecurity Act. The Biosecurity Act was brought in 2015. It's a Commonwealth Act of Parliament, and I think during the Abbott government, when Morrison was given his instructions from whoever it is that gives him his instructions to start carrying out the measures that all of the other countries around the world started carrying out in tandem, he would have turned to the Biosecurity Act and he would have said, oh, bugger me, this act's got teeth. There's some really serious protections to people in respect of their privacy of their information and in respect of all the measures that I plan to take through the states. And so he's kicked the Biosecurity Act into touch as well. The Biosecurity Act will only come into play when the Health Minister, Mr Hunt I said, when Mr Hunt makes directions under that, and he's only made two that matter. The reason we can't leave the country is because he's made a direction under the Biosecurity Act about that, and it's also the reason we're subject to quarantine when we come back in. Other than that, he's not made any meaningful directions. So you hear people talk about what's happening in the States is inconsistent with Commonwealth law. There has to be an operational inconsistency. Morrison and Hunt have to issue their own declarations under this Act before it's inconsistent with the state legislation. Now, I'm not the people who tell you all about the Biosecurity Act. I'm sure they're well-intentioned, they're trying to lift your spirits, but we've got to be smart. We've got to be courageous, and we've got to be smart, and we've got to take advantage of the remedies that are available. Now, I'm going to wind up now. Getting back to Andrew's position, what I wanted to say to you, there are two aspects to our resistance, and we've got to resist. What I'm preaching today, let me be frank about it, carrying the risk of incitement, I'm preaching insurrection. I'm preaching revolt. I'm preaching rebellion. Peaceful. Peaceful. Now, I'm going to suggest all of the rallies, everything that's done happens in a very fair consultative process. My suggestion is going to be that the next rally is outside one of the institutions that's right at the heart of the machinery that's carrying out this tyranny. Why don't we meet at the entertainment centre, which also happens to be the rooms for Channel 7? A crowd this size and more, why don't we meet there and insist on going in? This has happened in Slovenia. So Slovenia were sick with their state broadcaster. They gathered, they went in whilst the lies are being peddled, whilst Koshi's sitting at his desk with spike proteins behind him talking about PCR test results and fraudulently claiming that a PCR test represents an infection, let alone a case. While they're doing, let's get into the studios. That's the sort of action I'm talking about. It may be, given the obstacles that we're facing, it may be that it's going to take generations to wind back all of the degradation of our civilization that's made us vulnerable, to falling for what they've done to us. That'll take time, but in the meantime, we can be guerrillas. We can be partisans. We can harass them. We can harry them. We can take up their time and their resources. That's why I say to you, especially with respect to any expiation notices you get for not submitting to a PCR test, or any expiation notices you get in relation to some other measures they take under the direction, that you don't pay the expiation fee. I know it's tempting. They've set that up. They've set it up so that you'll pay the $1,000 rather than take the risk of 2 years imprisonment or $10,000. Don't pay it. Get them to issue the summons. There are good defences available. There are good defences available to this. The same with masks. If you get an expiation notice, that arises from a part of the declaration which gives the police commissioner a power to order rules that prevent the transmission of infection. You know as well as I do, masks don't do that. I'm going to have to wind up. There are many other people who need to speak. Can I just say to you that, in conclusion, that my whole attitude changed to this pandemic and my response to it when I sat down and I said to myself, what would it be like if I woke up every day and undertook to myself never to be afraid? And let me tell you, it's made all the difference. I invite you to do it.